The door slammed with such force that Cordelia Thorne felt it in her bones. The sound echoed across the frozen yard like a gunshot, sharp and final, the kind of sound that separates one life from another. She stood in the snow outside the house she had called home for 3 years, her 9-year-old daughter Eleanor pressed against her side, both of them holding nothing but what they had been wearing when Victor discovered the letter 2 hours earlier. No coats beyond what they wore, no food, no money, just the clothes on their backs and each other. December 20th, 1884, Wyoming Territory. The temperature had already dropped to 20 degrees below zero, and the sun had set an hour ago. The cold was not the gentle cold of autumn evenings or the crisp cold of early winter mornings. This was the killing cold, the kind that turned exposed skin white within minutes, the kind that could stop a heart before dawn. Victor appeared in the window, a dark silhouette against the lamplight inside. He was watching to make sure they left. His face, purple with rage just moments ago, had settled into something worse: satisfaction. The satisfaction of a man who believed he had defended his honor. The letter had been innocent, a simple note from Benjamin Fletcher, the schoolteacher, praising Eleanor's progress with arithmetic and asking if Cordelia might have time to help organize the school's small library. The teacher had signed it respectfully, formally, nothing more than a professional inquiry. But Victor had been drinking since morning, as he had been doing more and more often since the mine reduced his management role. In his liquor-soaked mind, the polite words of an educated man had become evidence of adultery, of conspiracy, of a betrayal that existed nowhere but in his imagination. Cordelia had tried to explain, tried to reason with him, but Victor was beyond reason. He had grabbed her by the arm, hard enough to leave bruises that would darken over the coming days. He had dragged her to the door, thrown Eleanor's thin coat after them, and slammed the door with such finality that Cordelia knew there would be no reasoning with him later. No apology accepted, no going back. The truth was simpler and uglier than Victor's accusations. 2 years ago, when Clara had died of consumption, Victor had begun making advances. At first subtle, then increasingly bold. Cordelia had refused every time, maintaining the dignity of her late sister's memory. This letter from the school teacher was merely the excuse Victor needed to rid himself of the woman who reminded him daily of his own moral failure. "Mama, I'm cold." Eleanor whispered the words, her voice very small against the vast silence of the frozen night. Her breath came out in white clouds that hung in the air before dissipating. Her lips were already losing color. "I know, sweetheart." Cordelia pulled her daughter closer, wrapping her shawl around both of them as best she could. "We're going to find somewhere warm, I promise." She looked back at the house one more time. Her house, the one she had kept clean and warm for 3 years. The one where she had cooked and mended and worked herself to exhaustion, trying to be a good sister-in-law to a man who saw enemies in every shadow. The windows glowed with warmth that was no longer hers. Victor's silhouette remained in the window, watching. They walked. Cordelia's mind raced through impossible calculations as they moved through the outskirts of Laramie. She had no money. Victor controlled every penny that came through the household. She had no family within 300 miles. Her parents had died of typhoid fever when she was 23, and her husband Thomas had perished in a mining accident 3 years ago, leaving her a widow at 29 with a 6-year-old daughter. After Clara's death, moving in with Victor had seemed like the only option, a temporary arrangement until she could find work. The boarding houses would want payment she could not provide. The church might offer one night's shelter, but then what? And there was something worse than the cold, worse than the hunger that would come. Victor had made sure everyone in town knew his version of events before he threw them out. She could see it in the faces of neighbors who turned away as she and Eleanor passed. Curtains moved in windows. Doors that might have opened remained firmly shut. The scandal of the unfaithful woman, the shame that attached itself to a woman cast out regardless of the truth. Cordelia had lived in this town for 3 years, had helped these neighbors when they were sick, had brought food when they were grieving. None of that mattered now. In the economy of small-town judgment, a woman accused was a woman condemned. They passed the boarding house where Mrs. Garrett stood in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest. The woman's eyes tracked Cordelia and Eleanor as they walked by, but she made no move to offer help. Her face held that particular expression Cordelia had seen before on other faces, the expression of someone who was glad misfortune had found someone else. They passed the general store, closed for the night, its windows dark. They passed the saloon where laughter and warmth spilled out every time the door swung open. Warmth that was not for them. "Where are we going, Mama?" Cordelia did not answer immediately. She was calculating. The church was 3 blocks north, but Reverend Blackwood had never liked her. He had commented once, in that way certain men had, that she was too proud for a woman of her station. He would give them one night and a sermon on wifely obedience, and then they would be back in the cold. The railroad yard. The thought came to her as they reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open land, and the tracks of the Union Pacific stretched east and west toward horizons she could not see in the darkness. She had passed the railroad yard countless times over the years, barely noticing the forgotten corners where broken or outdated equipment sat abandoned, slowly rusting into the Wyoming soil. But now, with Eleanor's hand growing colder in hers, and darkness settling over the town like a heavy blanket, she noticed everything with new eyes. The eyes of someone desperate, the eyes of someone with no other options. "Come," she said to Eleanor, "I have an idea." The railroad yard sprawled at the edge of Laramie, a maze of tracks and sidings where freight cars waited for morning trains. In the daylight, it was a place of noise and motion, of steam and shouting men, and the constant rumble of commerce moving across the continent. But at night, in winter, it was quiet as a graveyard. Cordelia led Eleanor along the edge of the yard, staying in the shadows, her eyes scanning the darkness for what she needed. And then she saw it. An old boxcar sat isolated on a rusted siding track, clearly forgotten by the railroad company. It had been red once, the proud red of the Union Pacific, but years of weather had faded the paint to a dull rust color that blended with the oxidized metal beneath. The car sat at an angle, one end slightly elevated where the track had settled unevenly over the years. Weeds grew around its wheels, brown and dead in winter, but evidence that no one had moved this car in a very long time. No recent footprints marked the snow around it, no signs of use or attention. It was as abandoned as Cordelia and Eleanor were. "Wait here." She left Eleanor beside a stack of railroad ties and approached the boxcar alone, her heart hammering in her chest. What if someone lived here already? What if it was locked? What if it was too damaged to provide shelter? The sliding door resisted at first, frozen in place by rust and ice. Cordelia pulled harder, throwing her weight against it. The door shrieked as it opened 6 inches, metal screaming against metal. She pushed harder, forcing it open a foot, wide enough to slip through. Inside, darkness and the smell of old wood and metal greeted her. But it was dry, completely dry and empty. Blessedly empty and forgotten. Wonderfully, perfectly forgotten. The floor beneath her feet was solid wood, surprisingly intact despite the years. She could barely see in the darkness, but what she could make out looked promising. Walls that would block the wind, a roof that would stop the snow, space enough for 2 people to survive the night. She returned for Eleanor, and together they climbed inside, Cordelia boosting her daughter up first, and then pulling herself through the opening. She left the door partially open, needing what little light remained from the stars and the distant glow of town to see by. The boxcar was perhaps 30 feet long and 8 feet wide, larger than many homestead cabins she had seen. The wooden floor was solid throughout, no major holes or rot. The walls showed gaps where boards had shrunk over time, letting in thin lines of starlight like a constellation mapped on wood. But the roof appeared sound, No snow on the floor, no water damage visible overhead. Is this where we're staying? Eleanor's voice was very small in the empty space. She stood close to Cordelia, her thin coat wrapped tight around her body, her breath making clouds in the darkness. Cordelia looked around at the abandoned boxcar, at the gaps in the walls that let in the cold, at the empty space that held nothing but shadows and the faint smell of whatever freight had been carried here years ago, at the door that would not close all the way. And she made a decision. Yes, this is our new home. In the corner near the door, something caught her eye, a glint of metal in the faint starlight. She moved toward it carefully, not wanting to alarm Eleanor, and found a small tin box wedged between two floor planks. The box was rusted around the edges, but still intact. Cordelia pried it open with stiff fingers and found inside a few coins, a spool of thread, and a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. She unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting was faded but legible, written in a woman's careful script. If anyone finds this place, know that it was once my home. I survived the winter of 1871 when I had nowhere else to go. This boxcar kept me alive. It can keep you alive too. But be careful. They don't want you to find what I've hidden. The truth about the silver mine, about what the Ashfords stole. Find the old rail line heading east. Count 47 steps from the dead oak tree, where iron meets earth. You are stronger than you know. A.M. Cordelia read the note twice, then a third time. Someone had survived here before. Someone had faced what she was facing and had lived to write these words. She folded the note carefully and placed it back in the tin, her mind already working through the implications. The Ashfords, that was Victor's family. A silver mine, something hidden. But those mysteries would have to wait. First, they had to survive the night. What did you find, Mama? A message from someone who lived here before us, someone who survived. Eleanor considered this, her 9-year-old mind working through the implications. Did they make it? Are they okay now? Cordelia thought about the note, about the hope it contained, about the woman who had written it 43 years ago. I believe they did, sweetheart. I believe they're just fine. They huddled together in the corner, farthest from the door that first night, wrapped in Cordelia's shawl and coat, with Eleanor's smaller coat layered over them both. The cold crept through every gap in the walls. Wind found its way inside, stirring their makeshift blankets. Eleanor fell into a fitful sleep against her side, exhaustion overwhelming even the cold. But Cordelia did not sleep. She could not sleep. Instead, she planned. The gaps in the walls needed sealing. Fire would have to be contained safely in a wooden structure. Food and water and warmth, all the things that separated survival from death, demanded solutions. Her father's face came to her then, dead these 9 years. She remembered his workshop behind their house in Ohio, where he had built furniture and repaired tools, and taught her brothers the skills of working with wood and metal. She had watched from the kitchen doorway, not understanding then that she was learning, that her eyes were recording information that would one day save her life. Her mother's voice followed, practical and calm, the voice that had kept a household running with almost nothing during the lean years after the panic of 1873. Everything has value, nothing is wasted. And then there was Thomas, somewhere in that warm house with the food she had cooked and the fire she had laid. No, that was wrong. Thomas was dead 3 years now, killed when a support beam collapsed in the Ashford mine. It was Victor in that house, Victor who had thrown her out, Victor who believed or pretended to believe she had shamed him. Something shifted inside her at the thought of him. Not anger, something colder than anger, something more useful. Determination. When gray dawn light filtered through the gaps in the walls, Cordelia studied their shelter with new eyes. The boxcar had been built to carry freight across the frontier. It was sturdy. The wooden slat walls were thick, the iron frame solid. The gaps between boards could be sealed. The door could be controlled. The floor, elevated off the ground on its iron wheels, would protect them from ground moisture and some of the cold. This could work. This had to work. Eleanor, she said softly, reaching out to touch her daughter's shoulder. Wake up, sweetheart, we have work to do. Eleanor's eyes opened slowly, confusion giving way to memory, giving way to something that broke Cordelia's heart. The look of a child who remembered that everything had changed. I need you to be very brave and very clever. Can you do that? The girl nodded, her young face solemn with the weight of their situation. We're going to make this into a real home. But first we need supplies, and I have no money, so we're going to have to be resourceful. The town dump lay a mile from the railroad yard, a growing heap of civilization's cast-offs that most people avoided. Cordelia had never paid it much attention before. Respectable people did not pick through trash. But respectability was a luxury she could no longer afford. She approached the dump like a prospector approaching a gold seam, seeing value where others saw only waste. What others discarded, she would reclaim. What society threw away, she would transform into tools for survival. They made multiple trips that first day, Eleanor helping to drag and carry their findings despite her cold, stiffened fingers. A cracked mirror, still mostly intact in its frame, one corner hammered into spiderweb fractures from impact, but the rest usable. Pieces of burlap sacking that could be stuffed into wall gaps for insulation. Newspapers, precious for both insulation and eventual kindling, their pages yellow but dry. A bent iron pot with a hole in the bottom that could potentially be patched. Scraps of wool fabric from someone's failed sewing project, moth-eaten in places but still useful. A length of rope, frayed at one end but still strong. Nails scattered in the dirt and ash. Eleanor proved especially good at finding these small treasures. Her young eyes were sharp, her small fingers nimble. She crawled into spaces Cordelia could not reach and emerged with handfuls of nails, rusted but usable. She found half a candle, barely used, probably dropped and lost. She found a tin cup with a dented side, buttons scattered like seeds, wire bent and twisted but still useful. Look, Mama. She held up a piece of slate, one corner cracked off but most of it intact. For my lessons. Cordelia felt tears sting her eyes. In the midst of survival, her daughter was thinking about education. That's wonderful, Eleanor. We'll make sure you don't fall behind. In the railroad yard itself, beyond the boxcar, Cordelia found other treasures abandoned or forgotten in the snow and shadows. A wooden pallet, perfectly sized to create a raised sleeping platform if she could figure out how to assemble it. Chunks of coal that had fallen from freight cars during loading. She and Eleanor collected these like precious gems, filling their pockets until the weight made their coats sag. Straw that had escaped from livestock cars, dirty but dry, which could provide crucial insulation. An old tarp, torn along one edge but still serviceable. Heavy canvas that would hold heat. Broken crates in various states of decay, some pieces still usable. A metal bucket with a rusted bottom, useless for water but potentially useful for other purposes. Each item was evaluated, considered, carried back to the boxcar or discarded. Cordelia's mind cataloged possibilities. This could be used for that. This could be combined with that to create something else. Poverty was teaching her to see potential in everything. On the fifth day, something happened that changed everything. Eleanor had wandered to the edge of the dump, searching for more nails, when Cordelia heard her call out with excitement in her voice. Mama, come look! She found her daughter crouched beside a pile of old canvas and rotting wood, and at first she did not see what had captured Eleanor's attention. Then a small head emerged from the pile. A dog, young, perhaps 2 years old, with matted golden fur and one ear that had been torn at some point and healed crooked. The animal was thin, ribs visible beneath the dirty coat, but its eyes were bright and alert. It's a dog, Mama. He's alone like us. The dog regarded them with cautious hope, the look of a creature that had learned not to trust, but wanted to trust anyway. We can't take care of a dog. We can barely take care of ourselves." But Eleanor had already extended her hand slowly, carefully, the way Cordelia had taught her to approach nervous animals. The dog sniffed her fingers, then licked them. Its tail, matted and dirty, began to wag hesitantly. "Please, Mama, he needs us." Cordelia looked at the dog, at its hopeful eyes and wagging tail. She thought about the nights ahead, about the long, dark hours when fear would creep in with the cold. She thought about Eleanor, 9 years old and facing hardship no child should face, and how her eyes had lit up for the first time since Victor threw them out. If he becomes a burden, but Eleanor was already pulling the dog from the pile, wrapping her thin arms around its neck. The dog leaned into the embrace like it was the first kindness it had known in a very long time. "I'll call him Ranger, because we found him in the wild places." Ranger it is, and despite everything, Cordelia smiled. The boxcar began to transform. Cordelia stuffed the burlap sacking into the largest gaps between wallboards, pushing it deep and securing it with nails from their collection. She layered newspapers over the burlap on the inside, creating an insulation barrier. The work was cold, her fingers stiff and aching, but she did not stop. Eleanor helped where she could, her small hands useful for reaching into tight spaces. She gathered the straw into piles, sorted the nails by size, and kept watch for anyone who might question what they were doing. Ranger appointed himself guard, lying near the door with his head on his paws, ears alert to any approaching footsteps. His presence was already proving valuable. The simple warmth of another living body in the confined space made the nights slightly more bearable. Fire was the greatest challenge, the one thing that could mean the difference between survival and death. Cordelia had matches, 3 of them, found in her coat pocket from some forgotten errand weeks ago. 3 matches to last until she could find or make more. 3 chances to create the warmth that would keep them alive. She built a small fire pit in one corner of the boxcar, as far from the wooden walls as possible, using flat stones she had carried one by one from the half-frozen creek bed a quarter-mile away. Each stone was carefully selected, flat, stable, non-porous to prevent cracking from heat. She arranged them in a circle, creating a barrier between the flames and the wooden floor. Inside the circle, she made a small nest of newspaper and wood scraps, the tiniest possible fire that might still produce useful heat. Her hands shook as she struck the first match. The sulfur flared bright in the dim interior of the boxcar. She carefully, reverently touched it to the paper. The flame caught, grew, spread to the kindling. Smoke began to rise, and Cordelia watched its path with intense focus. Would it fill the boxcar? Would they suffocate? Would she have to extinguish this precious fire? But the smoke rose naturally toward the roof, seeking escape. She discovered that by partially opening the door and creating a small gap near the roof on the opposite side, using a stick to prop open a loose board, she could create a cross draft that pulled the smoke out efficiently. The boxcar became a chimney of sorts, the smoke escaping through carefully controlled gaps she had been planning to seal. Perhaps some gaps were useful after all, she realized. Everything had a purpose if you understood its nature. The fire, fed carefully with coal and scraps of wood, transformed the space immediately. Heat radiated from the stones, pushing back the December cold that had been seeping into their bones. The metal walls, which had seemed like they would never warm, began to hold and reflect the heat. Eleanor held her hands near the flames, and color returned to her cheeks, bringing life back to features that had been going gray with cold. Ranger crept closer to the fire, his tail thumping against the wooden floor. He let out a sigh of contentment that made Eleanor laugh, and the sound of her daughter's laughter was more warming to Cordelia than any flame. "It works! Mama, you made it work! We made it work! All 3 of us." The first skeptic came on the second week. Cordelia was returning from the dump with an armload of fabric scraps when she saw the woman standing near the boxcar, peering at it with an expression of distaste and fascination. Martha Pendleton, wife of the feed store owner, A woman who knew everyone's business and made sure everyone else knew it too. Well, well, look what we have here. Martha's voice carried that particular tone of false sympathy that was worse than open cruelty. I heard Victor finally threw you out, but I didn't believe it until now. Living in an old boxcar like a vagrant, how the mighty have fallen. Cordelia said nothing. She walked past Martha and climbed into the boxcar, her arms full of fabric. She would not engage, would not defend, would not give this woman the satisfaction of a reaction. You know, Martha continued, raising her voice to make sure Cordelia could hear, if you'd been a proper sister-in-law, this wouldn't have happened. A woman's place is supporting her family, not carrying on with school teachers. Still, Cordelia said nothing. She set down her fabric and turned to help Eleanor, who was approaching with her own smaller bundle. Martha's eyes narrowed. The silent treatment, is it? Fine, but don't come crying to me when you freeze to death in that metal coffin. And don't expect anyone in town to help you. You made your bed when you spread your legs for Benjamin Fletcher. Eleanor's face went red. She started to say something, but Cordelia put a hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm. Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Pendleton. We'll manage. Martha huffed and turned away, already composing in her mind the story she would tell at the general store, at the church, at every gathering where women exchange gossip over tea and judgment. When she was gone, Eleanor looked up at her mother with tears of anger in her eyes. Why didn't you tell her the truth? Why didn't you tell her Uncle Victor was wrong? Cordelia knelt down to her daughter's level. Because some people don't want the truth, sweetheart. They want a story that makes them feel better about themselves. And nothing I say will change her mind. But it's not fair. No, it's not fair. But we can't control what other people think. We can only control what we do. And what we're going to do is survive. We're going to build a home here that's better than anything she has. And when we do, the truth won't matter because our lives will speak for themselves. Ranger pressed against Eleanor's leg, and the girl wrapped her arms around the dog's neck, finding comfort in his solid warmth. Let them talk. We'll show them. A different visitor came that same afternoon. Silas Grayson had worked for the railroad for 40 years before his body gave out. Now he lived in a small shack at the edge of town, surviving on a pension and the occasional odd job. He was 72 years old, with a white beard that reached his chest and eyes that had seen the frontier transform from wilderness to civilization. He approached the boxcar slowly, leaning on a walking stick, and stood watching Cordelia stuff insulation into the wall gaps. You're doing it wrong. Cordelia turned, ready for another confrontation, but Silas's face held no judgment, just observation. The burlap, you're packing it too tight. Air needs to be trapped in the material to insulate. Pack it loose, then cover it with paper to hold it in place. How do you know that? I spent 30 years in boxcar dormitories when we were building the transcontinental line. You learn things when your life depends on it. He moved closer, examining her work with a critical eye. Your fire pit is good, stone placement is solid, but you need a metal sheet under it. Wood will eventually char through, and then you'll have a real problem. Where would I find a metal sheet? Silas smiled, revealing gaps where teeth used to be. Follow me. He led her to a corner of the railroad yard she had not explored, where old equipment parts had been abandoned in a pile. Buried under rusted wheels and broken couplings, he found a piece of sheet metal about 2 feet square. This will do. Put it under your stones and you won't burn through the floor. Cordelia took the metal, feeling its weight, its promise of safety. Why are you helping me? Silas shrugged, his old shoulders lifting beneath his worn coat. Maybe because I was alone once too. Maybe because I don't like watching good people suffer while bad people prosper. Maybe because I'm old and bored, and you remind me of my daughter, God rest her soul. He turned to go, then stopped. I have some tools I don't use anymore. I'll bring them by tomorrow. And Mrs. Thorne? Yes? You're going to make it. I've seen that look in your eyes before. the look of someone who refuses to die. The first 3 days they ate nothing at all. Cordelia's stomach cramped with hunger, but she tried to hide it from Eleanor, whose eyes grew larger in her thinning face. She gave her daughter the last of the stale bread she had found in her pocket the first night, telling her she had already eaten. Eleanor did not believe her. Cordelia could see it in the way the child's gaze lingered on her mother's gaunt cheeks. But the girl ate anyway because she was 9 years old and hungry beyond pride. On the fourth day, Cordelia swallowed what remained of her dignity and approached the back door of the Grand Hotel kitchen, where she had occasionally bought vegetables when she had money for such things. The cook, Dorothea Whitmore, was a widow who had come to Wyoming with her husband during the railroad building years. Her husband had died in a tunnel collapse, but she had stayed, finding work in the hotel kitchen where her skills had eventually made her indispensable. She answered Cordelia's hesitant knock and looked at her with something between pity and caution. She had clearly heard Victor's version of events, the whole town had, but her expression softened when she saw Eleanor standing behind her mother, thin and cold and trying to be brave. And it softened further when she noticed Ranger sitting at the girl's feet, equally thin, equally hopeful. Without a word, Dorothea turned and disappeared into the kitchen. She returned with a pot of stew that she claimed was burned on the bottom, not fit to serve guests, and a bag of bread rolls that had gone stale, unsuitable for the dining room. The stew was perfectly fine, rich with vegetables and chunks of beef that made Cordelia's mouth water. The rolls were soft and fresh, still warm from the oven. Dorothea pressed the food into Cordelia's hands and would not meet her eyes, as if embarrassed by her own kindness or afraid of what others might say. Tomorrow, same time, I'll have more food that's not good enough for customers. Cordelia understood the fiction and accepted her part in it. Thank you. The older woman nodded once and closed the door, but not before Cordelia saw the glisten of tears in her eyes. From that day forward, Dorothea burned pots regularly, always at the end of the day when Cordelia came quietly to the kitchen door. Sometimes it was stew, sometimes soup, sometimes bread that had supposedly overbaked. Once a whole chicken that had been seasoned wrong, though it tasted perfect to Cordelia and Eleanor, who ate it slowly over 3 days, savoring every bite. Cordelia supplemented these gifts by setting snares near the creek. She remembered watching her father and brothers trap rabbits on their farm in Ohio, back when she was young enough to believe that childhood was eternal. She had observed from the kitchen doorway while her mother called her in to help with dinner, not understanding then that she was learning skills that might one day keep her alive. Using the wires she had found, she created simple, loop snares and placed them near runs she identified in the snow, paths where rabbits traveled repeatedly, their tracks telling stories in the white expanse. Eleanor learned to check the snares each morning, her small footprints in the snow becoming a familiar pattern alongside the animal tracks. Ranger learned not to disturb the traps, though he always sniffed them, hopefully, his tail wagging with restrained enthusiasm. They caught rabbits, occasionally a squirrel. Cordelia skinned and cooked them over their small fire, fighting through her initial squeamishness to do what had to be done. The alternative was starvation, and starvation was not an option. She saved every part of each animal, wasting nothing as her mother had taught her. The meat for eating, carefully portioned to make it last. The pelts for warmth, cleaned and dried and added to their growing collection of insulation. The sinew for binding and sewing, stronger than thread. The bones for broth, boiled until they gave up every bit of nutrition, then saved for potential tools. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap had value, just as her mother had said during those lean years after the panic when money became scarce and choices became stark. Eleanor proved adept at the practical necessities of survival. She learned to identify which wood burned hottest, which coal pieces were worth collecting, how to arrange kindling for maximum efficiency. She sorted their salvaged nails by size without being asked, creating an organized system that would make future repairs easier. She discovered which corners of the boxcar held warmth best and which let in drafts that needed addressing. One evening, as Cordelia sewed by lamplight and Eleanor practiced letters on her salvaged slate, the girl looked up with a question that made Cordelia's hands pause mid-stitch. "Mama, are we poor?" Cordelia surveyed their boxcar domain. The fire cast dancing shadows on walls they had insulated with their own hands. Their sleeping platform, constructed from salvaged wood and trash heap fabric, was nevertheless warm and secure. They had a roof that did not leak, walls that mostly kept out the wind, a fire that pushed back the bone-deep freeze of Wyoming winter. They had each other. They had Ranger, who was growing sleek and healthy on scraps and love. They had the small routines that made each day bearable: checking snares at dawn, collecting coal in the afternoon, cooking dinner as the sun set, reading by firelight before sleep. "No, sweetheart, we're not poor. We're rich in what matters." Eleanor considered this, her 9-year-old mind working through the philosophy of poverty and wealth, measuring her current life against the one they had left behind in Victor's house, with its warm rooms and full pantry and constant undercurrent of threat. Then she nodded and returned to her letters, accepting her mother's definition of riches without further argument. The railroad inspector came on a Tuesday morning in late December, just over a week after they had moved into the boxcar. Cornelius Webb was a tall man with a thin mustache and eyes that cataloged everything they saw, recording details with the precision of someone whose job depended on noticing what others overlooked. He worked for the Union Pacific, responsible for tracking company assets and removing unauthorized occupants from railroad property, vagrants, squatters, anyone who thought abandoned equipment meant free shelter. He approached the boxcar with 2 men behind him, witnesses to whatever would happen next, their presence lending official weight to his authority. "You there." Cordelia was returning from checking the snares when she heard him call. She straightened her spine and walked toward him, aware that Eleanor was watching from inside the boxcar, aware that Ranger was growling low at the strange men, aware that this moment could end everything they had built. "This is railroad property. You're trespassing on Union Pacific land." Cordelia had known this moment would come. She had prepared for it in her mind, rehearsed responses, imagined scenarios. But facing it was different than imagining it, harder and more immediate. "I wasn't aware this car was still in use. It appeared abandoned." Webb's eyes narrowed, cataloging her careful speech, her educated diction, trying to reconcile the evidence of a woman living in a boxcar with the bearing of someone who had once belonged to respectable society. "Abandoned or not, it belongs to the railroad. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises, or I'll have you arrested for trespassing." 48 hours. In 48 hours, she could not find another shelter. She could not move everything they had built. She could not start over in the depth of winter, with temperatures dropping further each night. "Please, we have nowhere else to go. My daughter, not my concern." Webb's voice was flat, bureaucratic, the tone of a man who had heard every excuse and hardship story and had learned to insulate himself against sympathy. "This is company property. You have 48 hours. He turned to leave, his witnesses already moving toward the gate, their duty discharged. But then he stopped as if a thought had occurred to him, a possibility that had not been mentioned in his initial pronouncement. Of course, there might be a way to extend that deadline. The railroad sometimes rents abandoned equipment to those who need temporary housing. $3 per week would secure your tenancy legally, make everything proper and above board. $3 a week, $12 a month, $144 a year, more than Cordelia could earn in a month of sewing, more than the coins in the tin box, more than she could possibly pay. "I don't have $3 a week." Now Webb turned fully, and there was something in his eyes that was worse than bureaucratic indifference. It was enjoyment, the subtle pleasure of a man who held power over someone powerless, who could offer hope and then watch it die. Then I suggest you find it, or find somewhere else to live. Good day, Mrs. Thorne." He walked away, his witnesses trailing behind him, and Cordelia stood in the frozen railroad yard, feeling the foundations of her careful survival begin to crack beneath the weight of impossible demands. She did not sleep that night. 48 hours. Then what? She could not go back to Victor. She would not go back to Victor, would not submit herself and Eleanor to his manipulation and the constant threat of his advances disguised as familial concern. The church might shelter them for a night or two, but Reverend Blackwood would demand repentance for sins she had not committed, would require her to acknowledge fault in Victor's accusations as the price of temporary mercy. $3 a week, $12 a month. The numbers circled in her mind like vultures over a dying animal, patient and inevitable. In the morning, she began walking to town with a purpose that Eleanor recognized immediately as determination hardened into action. She knocked on doors throughout Laramie, offering her services as a seamstress, as a laundress, as a housekeeper. Most doors closed in her face as soon as the occupants recognized her. The fallen woman, the one Victor Ashford threw out for adultery. The scandal attached to her like a brand, visible and damning regardless of truth. But Dorothea knew people, and some of those people needed work done and cared more about quality than scandal. By the end of the first week after Webb's visit, Cordelia had earned 60 cents mending a dress for a guest passing through town, someone who did not know the local gossip and judged only the precision of her stitches. By the end of the second week, she had earned $2 patching clothes and hemming trousers for a ranch hand who cared nothing for town politics. Word spread quietly among those who valued skill over reputation. Cordelia worked by lamplight in the boxcar, her stitches small and precise, while Eleanor did her lessons nearby and Ranger slept at their feet. Every coin went into the tin box where Annabelle's note had been found, each penny bringing her closer to survival, to the $3 that would buy another week of tenancy, another week of relative safety. When Webb returned for his money on the 48th hour exactly, timing his arrival with bureaucratic precision, she had $3.12. She counted the money into his palm, coin by coin, each one representing hours of work by dim lamplight, each one a small victory against the forces trying to crush her. Webb took the money and told her she had another week, his voice containing no warmth, no acknowledgement of the effort those $3 represented. Next week, another $3. Don't be late. On the 30th of December, while Cordelia was working late into the evening to finish mending a coat that would earn her another $1, Eleanor made a discovery that would change everything. The girl had been studying Annabelle's note, reading and rereading the faded words by firelight, her young mind working on the puzzle the dead woman had left behind. "Mama, I found something." Eleanor's excitement was tempered by caution. They had learned to keep their voices low, to avoid drawing attention from anyone who might pass near the boxcar after dark. The note says, "Old rail line heading east." "I think I know where that is. Silas showed me his map when he was here yesterday, and there's an abandoned spur line that used to go to the old mines." Cordelia set aside her sewing and took the note from Eleanor's hands, reading it again with fresh attention. "Find the old rail line heading east. Count 47 steps from the dead oak tree, where iron meets earth." What did Annabelle hide? And why did she think people would try to stop someone from finding it? The mention of the Ashfords, of a silver mine, of stolen truth, these fragments suggested something larger than a simple keepsake, something dangerous enough that Annabelle had risked writing it down before her death. "Can we go look, Mama? Can we find it?" Cordelia thought about Victor's rage when he discovered the letter from Benjamin Fletcher, how his anger had seemed disproportionate even for a jealous man, how quickly he had moved to throw them out. She thought about Webb's cold efficiency, his willingness to extort money from a widow and child, his lack of any human compassion. She thought about the way Victor's eyes had lingered on the boxcar the one time he had ridden past on his horse. how his gaze had held something beyond contempt, something that might have been recognition or fear. Tomorrow, we'll ask Silas to show us where that old rail line is. But Eleanor, this has to be our secret. We can't let anyone know we're looking for anything. Why not? Because if what Annabelle hid is important enough to write about, it's important enough for someone to want it to stay hidden. And we don't know who that someone might be. Eleanor nodded with a solemnity beyond her years, understanding filtering through her young features. She had learned much in these weeks about the way the world worked, about trust in danger, and the careful navigation required to survive when you had nothing and no one. Silas came the next morning with tools as promised. A hammer that had seen decades of use but still swung true. A saw with a blade that needed sharpening but would serve. Nails of various sizes sorted into a coffee tin. He also brought information when Cordelia asked casually about old rail lines in the area. The abandoned spur heading east used to service the Silverton mine. Been shut down since '71, maybe '72. Tracks all grown over now, buried under weeds in summer and snow in winter. Nobody goes out that way anymore. Why do you ask? Just curious. Eleanor was asking about local history for her studies. The old man's eyes sharpened slightly, seeing through the casual question to something beneath, but he did not press. If you're thinking about exploring out that way, be careful. The old mine shafts are dangerous, half collapsed, most of them. And there are other dangers too, the kind that come with disturbed earth and forgotten claims. What kind of dangers? The kind where someone might not want you poking around in old business best left buried. The Ashford family made their fortune from that mine, you know. Victor's grandfather bought the claim back in '50 or so, worked it until it ran dry, then abandoned it. But there were always whispers about how he came by the claim in the first place. Questions that never got answered proper like. Cordelia felt something cold settle in her stomach. A premonition of truths she was not yet ready to hear, but would have to face nonetheless. What kind of questions? Silas glanced at Eleanor, then back to Cordelia, weighing what to say in front of the child. Questions about who really found that silver first, and what happened to them after. Questions about documents that went missing from the land office. Questions that got people labeled troublemakers when they asked too loud or too often. Annabelle Morse was one of those people, back before you were born. She worked for the Ashfords as a house servant, raised there from a girl after her parents died. Then one day she was accused of theft and thrown out with nothing but the clothes on her back. Froze to death in this very boxcar, matter of fact, in the winter of '71. Cordelia's hand moved unconsciously to where the tin box sat hidden beneath a loose floorboard, where Annabelle's note remained folded inside, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to follow its directions. Why would they accuse her of theft if she'd been with the family so long? Silas shrugged, but his eyes held knowledge he was choosing not to speak aloud. Not yet. Some folks said she knew things she shouldn't have known, saw things she wasn't supposed to see. Working in a house like that, you hear things, find things, learn things that powerful people would rather keep quiet. Maybe she knew too much. Maybe she took something that wasn't hers to take, but wasn't the Ashfords either. Hard to say this many years later, and most folks who might have told the truth are dead now. He gathered his tools and prepared to leave, but paused at the door. Just be careful, Mrs. Thorne. The past has a way of reaching into the present, especially when there's money involved. And the Ashfords didn't get rich by being careless about protecting what they consider theirs. On the 6th of January, 1885, Victor Ashford appeared at the boxcar for the first time since throwing Cordelia out. He rode up on his horse just as dusk was settling, his breath and the animals creating white clouds in the frozen air. He dismounted and stood looking at the boxcar with an expression Cordelia could not quite read from inside. Cordelia stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind her to keep Eleanor and Ranger inside, away from whatever confrontation was coming. What do you want, Victor? His eyes swept over her, cataloging the changes 3 weeks of hardship had wrought. The weight she had lost, the way her dress hung looser, the roughness of her hands from work they had never done in his house. But there was also something else in his assessment, something grudging that might have been respect or might have been resentment at her survival. I want Eleanor. The law gives me rights as her guardian. Clara's will specified that if anything happened to you, I was to take responsibility for the girl. Cordelia felt ice flood her veins, colder than any Wyoming winter. Nothing has happened to me. I'm perfectly capable of caring for my daughter. Are you? Living in a boxcar, scavenging through dumps, setting snares like a trapper. Judge Harrison is a friend of mine. We had a very interesting conversation about guardianship rights and what constitutes an unfit living situation. No court in this territory will leave a child in these conditions when I'm offering a proper home. The threat was clear and carefully constructed. Victor had thought this through, had laid groundwork with the judge, had prepared his case with the same attention to detail he brought to his mining operations. Here's what's going to happen, Cordelia. You're going to come back to the house. You're going to apologize publicly, and you're going to stop refusing my very reasonable suggestions about how we might both find comfort in Clara's absence. There it was, spoken aloud finally, the truth beneath all his accusations and manipulations. He wanted her compliant, grateful, obligated. He wanted her to choose the safety of his house over her own autonomy, to trade Eleanor's welfare for her own degradation. Or what? You'll take my daughter and I'll never see her again? If that's what it takes. But I'd rather not. It would be easier for everyone if you just came home and accepted reality. Judge Harrison has already drafted the paperwork. All it needs is my signature and Eleanor becomes my ward, legally removed from your custody until you can prove yourself fit, which, given your current circumstances, might be years, might be never. He remounted his horse, satisfied he had delivered his ultimatum with sufficient force. You have until the end of the month to decide. Come home on my terms or lose your daughter. Those are your options. He rode away without waiting for a response, confident in his position, secure in his power. And Cordelia stood in the frozen yard watching him go, feeling the trap close around her with mechanical precision. Inside the boxcar, Eleanor pressed against the wall near the door, having heard everything despite Cordelia's attempt to shield her from the conversation. Mama, I don't want to go to Uncle Victor's. I want to stay here with you and Ranger. This is our home. Cordelia pulled her daughter close, holding her tight against the rising panic in her own chest. We're not going back. I promise you, we're not going back. But we need help, the kind of help that can stand up to a man like Victor in a court of law. Where do we find that? I don't know yet, but we're going to find it. 2 days later, Benjamin Fletcher appeared at the boxcar, his arrival causing Cordelia's heart to lurch with fear. I've heard he's threatening to take Eleanor through the courts. I know a lawyer, Augustus Brennan, who handles cases. He was old, perhaps 70, with wild white hair that seemed to defy any attempt at grooming, and a suit that had been elegant 20 years ago, but now bore the marks of age and constant wear. His office was a chaos of papers and books, stacked on every surface, covering the desk, filling chairs, creating towers that threatened to topple with the slightest movement. He greeted Cordelia with a warmth that surprised her, his eyes sharp and assessing behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Sit, sit. Just move those files to the floor. Benjamin told me about your situation. Tell me everything. And don't leave out details you think might be unimportant. Sometimes the smallest things matter most in law. So she did. She told him about the letter from Benjamin and Victor's accusations, about being thrown out into the cold with Eleanor, about the boxcar and the railroad inspector, and Victor's threat to take her daughter through the courts. She told him things she had not told anyone about the bruises Victor had left over the years, always in places clothing would hide, about his drinking that had worsened after Clara's death, about the way he controlled every penny and every decision in the household. She told him about the advances that had begun subtly after Clara's funeral and grown more insistent with each refusal, about how the letter from Benjamin had simply provided the excuse Victor needed to rid himself of a woman who would not submit. Augustus listened without interrupting, his pen moving across paper in quick strokes, taking notes with the concentration of someone who had learned that details won cases. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes distant with thought. The law is not kind to women in your situation. You're correct that fathers and male guardians have extensive rights. A judge could indeed award custody to your brother-in-law, especially given that you're living in what most would call unconventional circumstances. Cordelia felt her hope beginning to die before it had fully formed. However, Augustus leaned forward, his eyes suddenly fierce. There are exceptions. If we can demonstrate that Victor Ashford is unfit, if we can show evidence of his drinking, his violence, his instability, his inappropriate advances toward a woman under his protection, we might be able to make a case. It won't be easy, it won't be quick, but it might be possible. What would I need to do? Document everything, every bruise, every threat, every instance of his drinking that you can verify. Find witnesses who have seen his behavior, and most importantly, show that you can provide a stable home for Eleanor despite your current circumstances. Augustus stood and moved to a filing cabinet, searching through drawers with practiced efficiency. There's something else. The boxcar you're living in, and the railroad inspector who's been harassing you. I've heard of Cornelius Webb. He has a history the railroad would prefer to keep buried. What kind of history? The old lawyer pulled out a yellowed folder, its edges worn soft with age. There was a woman 43 years ago. She lived in that same boxcar. Webb had her removed in the middle of winter. She died shortly after. Her family tried to sue the railroad, but Webb made evidence disappear. This woman's name was Annabelle Morse. Cordelia felt the air leave her lungs. The note in the tin box, the careful handwriting, the warning about people who did not want the truth found. Suddenly, these fragments were connecting into a pattern. What happened to her? Why did Webb evict her? Augustus studied her face, reading something there that made him choose his next words carefully. The official reason was trespassing, but there were whispers at the time that Annabelle had worked for the Ashford family before she was thrown out. People who thought she knew something about how Victor's grandfather acquired the Silverton mine. Something that didn't sit right with the original claim. Cordelia's mind raced to the note, to the mention of 47 steps from a dead oak tree. What do you mean, the original claim? Augustus settled back into his chair. In 1850, a local family, they called themselves the Silver Creek people, discovered silver in what's now the Silverton mine. They registered their claim properly according to the mining law of '49. But within months, Ashford Sr. somehow produced documents showing he had filed the claim first, on the exact same day, but at an earlier hour. The Silver Creek family was evicted from land they'd worked, and they lost everything. They claimed the Ashford documents were forged, but they had no proof. And Annabelle knew about this? Augustus opened the folder and showed Cordelia yellowed documents, affidavits, newspaper clippings, records of the failed lawsuit. She worked in the Ashford household for 15 years. She would have seen things, heard things. When she was accused of theft and thrown out, some people thought it was because she'd taken evidence of the fraud. But no one ever found anything, and she died before she could tell anyone where she might have hidden it. The room seemed to tilt as Cordelia understood the full weight of what Annabelle's note might mean. If that evidence still exists, if someone could find it, what would it mean legally? Augustus removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a handkerchief. The mining law is federal. If we could prove the Ashford claim was fraudulent, that the original Silver Creek claim was valid, then everything built on that mine, the profits, the property purchased with those profits, all of it would be subject to restitution. We're talking about nearly 40 years of accumulated wealth based on stolen land. Victor would lose everything. And if I happen to find such evidence, then I would advise you to bring it to me immediately, before anyone else knows you have it, because powerful men protect their power with whatever means necessary. That night, Cordelia stood outside the boxcar, watching the stars emerge in the frozen sky. Eleanor appeared beside her, wrapped in salvaged fabric. "You're thinking about the note, aren't you? About what Annabelle hid?" "I'm thinking about how sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to take risks that terrify you. Are we going to look for it? If we do, it could be dangerous. Victor might find out. Webb might find out." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her young face solemn. "But if we don't look, Uncle Victor takes me away, and you lose everything anyway. At least if we look, we're fighting back." Cordelia felt something shift in her chest, recognizing that her daughter had crossed some threshold from childhood into harder wisdom. "When did you become so wise?" "When we started living in a boxcar, and I realized nobody was going to save us. We have to save ourselves." The next morning, Cordelia, Eleanor, and Silas made their way to the old rail line, heading east. The spur track was barely visible under snow and overgrowth, a ghost of commerce that had once flowed along its path. They followed it for a mile, their breath white clouds in the morning air. Silas pointed to a twisted oak tree standing alone in a field of white. "That's been dead as long as I can remember. Lightning strike, maybe, years before I came here." Cordelia pulled out Annabelle's note, reading the faded words again. "Count 47 steps from the dead oak tree, where iron meets earth." They counted together, Eleanor keeping the tally. 47 steps brought them to where the old rail line curved slightly, where a section of track was partially buried by decades of soil movement. Where iron meets earth, the phrase made perfect sense now. Silas knelt, brushing snow away from the rail. If someone wanted to hide something they never wanted found, but wanted to leave directions just in case, this would be the place. He produced a small shovel from his pack. Together they began to dig, the work slow and difficult in frozen earth. 15 minutes revealed nothing. 30 minutes passed with only frustration. Eleanor suddenly stopped, her hand on Ranger's collar. "Someone's coming. A rider." They heard it then, a horse moving through snow, approaching from town. Cordelia felt panic surge. "Hide the digging. Make it look like we're just exploring." Silas quickly pushed snow back over their excavation, while Cordelia and Eleanor moved away from the spot, trying to appear casual. The rider came into view, Cornelius Webb, mounted on a dark horse. He rode directly toward them with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he would find. "Mrs. Thorne, what an unexpected pleasure to find you so far from your accommodations." His voice carried sarcasm and warning. "Mr. Grayson was showing my daughter some local history, the old mining operations." Webb's eyes swept over the scene, taking in the disturbed snow near the buried rail, the shovel poorly concealed behind Silas. "History can be dangerous, Mrs. Thorne. People dig up the past and find things they wish they'd left buried." He dismounted and walked toward them, each step deliberate. "I know what you're looking for. Victor sent word that you might come poking around out here. He's very interested in making sure certain historical matters remain undisturbed." Cordelia stood her ground. "We're just walking. There's no law against walking on abandoned railroad property." "No, but there are laws against trespassing with intent to steal railroad property. And I'm the one who enforces those laws in this territory." He moved closer to where they had been digging. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop digging around in places you don't belong. You're going to stop asking questions about the Ashford family's business. You're going to go back to your boxcar, pay your rent on time, and mind your own survival. Because if you don't, I'll find reasons to make your life considerably more difficult than it already is." He remounted his horse, looking down at them. "And if you somehow manage to find what you're looking for, I'll make sure it disappears just like everything else that threatened the Ashford interests." I've had 43 years of practice making problems go away, Mrs. Thorne. Don't become a problem. He rode away, leaving them standing in the frozen field with the knowledge that they were being watched, that their search had been anticipated. Eleanor's small hand found Cordelia's. He knows what's here. He knows what Annabelle hid, which means it's real, and it's worth protecting, which means we're on the right track. Silas watched Webb disappear before speaking, his voice low and urgent. That was a direct threat. Webb doesn't make threats lightly. If we keep looking, he'll find ways to stop us. Then we come back at night, when he's not watching. That's exactly when he'll be watching. Men like Webb don't give warnings and then go home. Cordelia looked at the spot where they had been digging. We wait 3 days. Let Webb think he scared us off. Then we come back with better tools and move faster. The 3 days passed with agonizing slowness. Cordelia continued her mending work, continued checking snares, continued the routines that kept them fed and warm. But her mind was always on that buried rail line, on what might be hidden beneath the frozen earth. On the third night, she made her move, not with Silas and Eleanor as before, but alone, in the hours after midnight, when even vigilant watchers might drowse. She left Eleanor sleeping with Ranger and made her way through the frozen darkness to the old rail line. The work was brutal in the cold, her hands quickly going numb despite gloves. She dug where they had started before, following the line of the buried rail, removing frozen earth inch by painful inch. An hour passed with nothing but blisters and aching muscles. 2 hours brought doubt. 3 hours in, her shovel struck something that was not earth or stone, something metallic that rang softly. She dug more carefully now, clearing soil away from what revealed itself to be a metal box about the size of a large book, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly disintegrated. She worked it free, her heart hammering. The sound of a horse approaching froze her in place. She extinguished her lantern and crouched low, clutching the box, praying darkness would hide her. The rider passed within 50 yards. Not Webb, but one of his men, hired to patrol, to watch for exactly what she was doing. When the sound faded, she filled in the hole as best she could, smoothing snow over disturbed earth. Then she ran, clutching the box, running through the frozen night, surviving on scraps and borrowed time, but refusing to surrender the one thing that might save her daughter. She made it back to the boxcar as false dawn was beginning to gray the eastern sky. Eleanor woke as Cordelia stumbled through the door. "You found it." Not a question, but certainty. "I found something. Whether it's what we need remains to be seen." The metal box was rusted but intact, sealed with a simple latch that had corroded closed. Cordelia worked it carefully with a knife, not wanting to damage whatever might be inside. The latch finally gave way. Inside were documents wrapped in more oilcloth, preserved against moisture and time. Cordelia read by lamplight while Eleanor pressed close. The letter from Annabelle was addressed to anyone who might find it. "My name is Annabelle Morse. I worked for the Ashford family from the age of 10, when they took me in after my parents died. I believed they were kind. I worked hard to repay their generosity. When I was 25, I overheard a conversation I was not meant to hear. Master Ashford Sr. was meeting with Cornelius Webb, then a young clerk in the land office. They were laughing about how easily they had forged documents to steal a mining claim from its rightful owners. They spoke of the Silver Creek family as if they were nothing. I began to investigate carefully, secretly. I found the original claim documents that the Silver Creek family had filed, properly witnessed and registered. I found the forgeries that Ashford created, dated the same day, but supposedly filed hours earlier. The signatures were different, the seals were different, but no one had checked because no one cared. I copied everything. I hid the originals here, at this rail line that Ashford used to transport silver from the mine he stole. When he discovered I knew his secret, he accused me of theft. He threw me out with nothing. Webb evicted me from the boxcar where I took shelter. I knew I was dying in the cold. knew I wouldn't survive to tell what I'd learned. So I left these documents in these directions, hoping someone would find them, hoping justice might be served even after my death. To whoever reads this, take these papers to the federal land office. Show them what the Ashfords did. Give the Silver Creek family back what was taken. Don't let my death be for nothing. Below the letter were the documents, original claim papers filed by Joseph Silver Creek on May 15, 1850, properly witnessed and sealed with the official stamp of the Territorial Land Office. And beside them, the forgeries created by Ashford Sr., identical dates but different handwriting, different seals poorly copied. Eleanor's voice was very small. They stole everything, and they killed Annabelle to keep the secret. Not just killed, they destroyed her reputation first, made sure no one would believe her. What do we do now? We take this to Augustus Brennan, just like Annabelle wanted. And then we hope the law is strong enough to stand up to men who have spent decades building power on lies. But as Cordelia carefully rewrapped the documents and placed them in a new hiding spot within the boxcar, a space behind the insulation where Benjamin had built a false panel, she understood with cold certainty that Augustus would not be enough. Victor and Webb had too much invested in keeping this secret buried. The next morning, Victor appeared at the boxcar earlier than expected, his face flushed with more than cold. "I know what you found. Webb told me about your little excavation project. You're going to give me whatever you dug up, and then you're going to sign papers transferring Eleanor into my custody voluntarily. Do that, and I'll let you stay in this boxcar rent-free. Refuse, and I'll have you arrested for theft, and Eleanor will become my ward anyway." Cordelia stepped out of the boxcar, closing the door firmly behind her, keeping Eleanor inside and out of immediate danger. "I don't know what you're talking about." Victor's laugh was ugly. "Don't play games with me, Cordelia. You found Annabelle's evidence, the claim documents, the proof of the forgery. Hand them over now, or I swear to God I'll see you hang for theft, and your daughter will grow up believing her mother was a criminal who died on a scaffold." The threat hung in the frozen air between them, naked and brutal. "Even if I had found something, and I'm not saying I did, what makes you think I'd give it to you? Because you're a smart woman, and smart women understand when they're beaten. You have no power, no money, no standing in this community. Judge Harrison will rule however I tell him to. The sheriff will arrest you if I ask. The whole machinery of this territory's law belongs to men like me, and you're nothing but a woman with dirt under her fingernails and desperation in her eyes." Cordelia felt the full weight of her powerlessness pressing down, the reality that Victor was probably right, that the law existed to protect men like him from women like her. But she also remembered Annabelle's letter, the careful handwriting of a woman who knew she was dying, who had spent her last strength creating a chance for truth to emerge. She remembered Eleanor sleeping with Ranger, trusting that her mother would protect her. "Get off my property, Victor." "Your property? This is railroad." Actually, according to records Augustus Brennan found, this boxcar was officially released from Union Pacific inventory in 1878. It's been sitting on unused siding for 7 years, unclaimed, which means by the laws of adverse possession, anyone who has lived here and improved it for a continuous period has a legitimate claim. I've been here for weeks, made substantial improvements. This is my home, legally and morally, and you're trespassing. Victor's face went from red to purple. "Fine, have it your way. Judge Harrison will issue the custody order by the end of the week. You'll never see Eleanor again except through bars. And when you're sitting in a cell wondering where it all went wrong, remember that I offered you a way out and you were too stupid to take it." He stalked back to his horse and mounted with violence in every movement. "You have 3 days to change your mind. After that, Eleanor belongs to me and you belong in prison." He rode away, and Cordelia stood watching until he disappeared, understanding that the fight she had been avoiding was now inevitable. Inside the boxcar, Eleanor had heard everything through the thin walls. "He's really going to take me away, isn't he?" Cordelia knelt beside her daughter. "Not if I can help it. We have 3 days to get those documents to people who matter, to find the Silver Creek family, if any of them still exist, to build a case that's too public for Victor to simply sweep away." But how? If the judge and the sheriff both answer to Uncle Victor, who's going to listen? Sometimes you have to make enough noise that people have to listen, whether they want to or not. The words surprised Cordelia even as she spoke them, realizing she had crossed some internal threshold, had moved from survival into something more dangerous and necessary: resistance. Eleanor's eyes were bright with tears, but also with determination. "Then let's make noise, Mama. Let's make so much noise they can't ignore us." Augustus listened to Cordelia's account with the careful attention of someone building a case brick by brick. She had brought the documents, the originals from Annabelle's cache, and copies she had made by lamplight. "This is extraordinary and extraordinarily dangerous." He spread the papers across his desk, comparing the original Silver Creek claim to the Ashford forgery. The signatures are completely different. The seal on the forgery is a poor copy. The witness names on the Ashford document don't match any registered residence. I can check the census records. This is such obvious fraud that I'm amazed it stood unchallenged for 40 years. It stood because nobody with power wanted to challenge it. Augustus nodded slowly. "The question now is whether we can find any living descendants of Joseph Silver Creek. If the family disappeared, if there are no heirs, the legal standing becomes complicated. But if we can find even one direct descendant, they have grounds to challenge the entire Ashford claim and demand restitution for 4 decades of stolen profits." How much money are we talking about? Augustus did quick calculations. The Silverton mine produced silver for approximately 20 years. Conservative estimates would put total extraction value at around $300,000. After expenses, the Ashford family probably netted about $200,000. Adjusted for interest and investment returns over 40 years, we're looking at a current value of at least $500,000 in land, property, and assets purchased with stolen money. Victor would lose everything. Victor would lose everything that wasn't obtained through legitimate means after the mining profits were exhausted. But yes, the core of his wealth, the foundation of the family's influence, all of it would be revealed as fruit from a poisoned tree. He can't let that happen, which is why we need to move fast and be very public about what we're doing. The more people who know about this evidence, the harder it becomes for Victor to make it disappear. We need to file these documents with the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne, publish notice in newspapers, and locate the Silver Creek descendants. His eyes held something that might have been excitement or might have been trepidation. "I've already begun searching. There was a Thomas Silver Creek, son of Joseph, who died in 1880. But he had a son, David, who would be 45 now. I sent a telegram to Idaho 3 days ago, where land records suggest he might be living. If he's still alive, if he responds, we have our plaintiff. How long will that take? A week, if we're lucky. 2 weeks if we encounter delays. Unfortunately, Victor has given you 3 days before he moves to take Eleanor. Then we make our stand in 3 days. We go to Judge Harrison with all of this. We make him understand that if he rules for Victor, he's complicit in a 40-year-old fraud and the death of Annabelle Morse. That's risky. Harrison is Victor's friend. He could rule against us immediately. Then I'll be in violation. But at least the truth will be public. At least Annabelle won't have died for nothing." Augustus studied her across his cluttered desk. "You understand that once we start this, there's no going back. Victor will use every resource to destroy you. Men with everything to lose are the most dangerous kind. I lost everything the night he threw Eleanor and me into the cold. I've been surviving on borrowed time since, living on scraps and the kindness of people brave enough to help. What more can he take except my daughter? And that's the one thing I will not let him have. Augustus gathered the documents carefully. Then let's prepare for war, Mrs. Thorne, because that's what this is going to be. A war between old power trying to protect itself and new truth trying to see daylight. Some wars are worth fighting even when the odds say you'll lose. Sometimes standing up is more important than staying safe. That night, a storm began to move into the territory, the kind that old-timers talked about for decades after, the kind that killed livestock and collapsed buildings. Silas appeared at the boxcar just as the first flakes began to fall. Big one coming. Worse than anything I've seen in 40 years. You need to prepare. This boxcar might be your salvation or your tomb, depending on how well it stands. How long do we have? Hours, maybe less. Once it hits full force, nobody will be able to move. Nobody will be able to help anyone else. Cordelia looked at Eleanor, at the fire burning in their hearth, at the insulation they had so carefully installed. We've survived this long. We'll survive a storm. But Silas was not finished. There's something else. Victor knows about the storm too. He might use it as cover to come for those documents, or for Eleanor, while everyone's trapped and nobody can intervene. Then we'll be ready. After Silas left, Cordelia moved the documents to an even more secure location, hiding them in a waterproof pouch inside the hollow of Ranger's sleeping area, protected by the dog's defensive instincts. She checked their supplies, coal for the fire, water stored in containers, food enough for several days if rationed. She reinforced the insulation around doors and windows, stuffing every gap. Eleanor helped with quiet efficiency, someone who had learned that survival meant preparation. If Uncle Victor comes during the storm, what do? We don't let him in. This is our home, and the law says a man can't enter a woman's home without permission or a warrant. But what if he doesn't care about the law anymore? Then we fight, not with violence, but with witnesses and publicity, and making sure everyone knows what he's trying to do. The storm hit just after midnight with a fury Cordelia had never experienced. Wind screamed around the boxcar like a living thing trying to tear it from its moorings. Snow driving horizontal with such force that it found every microscopic gap. The temperature plummeted to depths that made previous cold seem mild. But the boxcar held. The improvements they had made proved their worth as the storm raged outside. The fire in the stone hearth burned steady, the ventilation working exactly as designed. The sleeping platform kept them elevated. The layers of salvaged fabric and newspaper and burlap created barriers that trapped warmth. Eleanor and Ranger pressed close to Cordelia through that first night, listening to the storm's fury, understanding they were experiencing something beyond ordinary weather. The second day brought a lull, the wind dropping slightly. Cordelia risked opening the door and found snow had drifted 5 feet high against one side, completely burying the lower portion. The world beyond was unrecognizable, every landmark erased by white. She was closing the door when she heard it, a knock, faint but unmistakable. "Mrs. Thorne, please, you have to help us." The voice was Martha Pendleton's, the woman who had mocked Cordelia, who had called her a vagrant, who had spread gossip throughout town. And now she was here, desperate, asking for help she had been quick to deny others. Cordelia opened the door to find Martha standing in snow up to her thighs, her husband supported between 2 other men, his face gray with pain, their children shivering behind them. "Our house collapsed. The weight of the snow, we barely got out. My husband's leg is broken, the children are freezing, and we have nowhere else to go. Please, I know I don't deserve your help, but they do." For one long moment, Cordelia held all the power Martha had wielded with her gossip and judgment. She could refuse, could turn away the woman who had tried to make her life harder, could exact revenge simply by closing the door. But Eleanor was watching, learning what kind of person her mother would be when given the choice between vengeance and mercy. And somewhere in the frozen ground nearby, Annabelle Morse rested, a woman who had died because others chose cruelty over compassion. "Come in, all of you," Quickly, before the wind picks up again. They came, stumbling into the warmth, Martha's family and then others who followed in the next hours, as buildings collapsed and fires went out, and people realized that the scavenged shelter they had mocked was standing stronger than the proper houses they had trusted. By the time the storm's second phase hit that evening, 14 people were crowded into the boxcar Cordelia had built from nothing. 14 lives depending on the insulation she had salvaged, the fire pit she had constructed, the ventilation system she had designed. Among the last to arrive, carrying his wife and 2 children through the blinding snow, was Cornelius Webb. He stood in the doorway, ice crusting his face, his family shaking behind him, his eyes meeting Cordelia's with something between desperation and shame. "I know I have no right to ask. I know what I've done, what I've helped Victor do. But my children, please." Cordelia thought about justice and mercy, about revenge and redemption, about the difference between becoming like your enemies and remaining better than them, even when they did not deserve it. "Come in." Webb entered last, his shoulders sagging with relief and something else. Recognition, perhaps, that he had been judged and found wanting, that mercy extended to him was more than he had ever shown others. He helped settle his family near the fire, his wife wrapping their children in whatever fabric Cordelia offered, his eyes watching as this woman who had every reason to refuse him instead gave what little she had. The storm raged for 3 more days, the world outside reduced to howling wind and blinding white. Inside the boxcar, 14 people shared space and warmth and the slowly depleting supplies Cordelia had gathered. She rationed the coal carefully, keeping the fire just hot enough to prevent freezing. She shared what food they had, the broth, the dried rabbit meat, the stale bread from Dorothea's last delivery before the storm. It was not enough for 14 people. It was not even close to enough. But no one complained. They had seen their houses collapse, their fires go out, their certainties crumble. They had learned in the span of hours what Cordelia had learned over weeks, that survival was not about deserving or status or reputation, but about determination and resourcefulness, and the willingness of one person to extend mercy when they could have chosen revenge. On the 3rd day inside the storm, Eleanor developed a fever. It started as a small cough, then grew worse. By evening she was burning hot to the touch, her breathing labored, her lips taking on a bluish tint that terrified Cordelia more than any storm. Dorothea, who had also sought shelter in the boxcar, knew something of medicine from her years cooking for miners and their families. She brewed tea from herbs she carried in her pocket, coaxing Eleanor to drink it spoonful by spoonful. But Eleanor grew worse through the night. Her fever climbed higher. Her breathing became rattling gasps that echoed in the confined space. Cordelia held her daughter, feeling the heat radiating from the small body, watching the life drain from her child's face, and understanding with crystalline clarity that all her fighting, all her determination, all her careful planning might end here in this storm, with her daughter dying in her arms. Emma Webb, Cornelius's 7-year-old daughter, developed the same symptoms by midnight: fever, cough, labored breathing, the same bluish tint creeping into her lips. Webb sat in the corner holding his daughter, his face a mask of anguish, watching his child struggle to breathe. "Mrs. Thorne," his voice cracked, barely audible above the storm's howl. For 43 years, he had told himself the same lies. It was just business, just following orders, just survival in a hard territory. He had buried Annabelle Morse not once but twice, first in the frozen ground, then in the locked chambers of his memory, where guilt went to die slowly, piece by piece, year by year. But guilt never truly died. It merely waited. It waited through decades of promotions and payments, through nights when he woke gasping from dreams of a young woman's frozen face. It waited through all the times he collected rent from desperate people, through all the moments when he could have chosen differently and chose not to. And now, watching his daughter struggle for breath, being saved by the very woman whose life he had tried to destroy, The weight of 43 years collapsed on him. His daughter's labored breathing sounded like Annabelle's must have sounded in those final hours. Alone in this very boxcar, dying because he had been too coward to stand up to a rich man's demands. I have to tell you something. I have to tell everyone something. Cordelia looked up from Eleanor, her daughter's labored breathing the only sound she wanted to hear, but Webb's face held something she had never seen there: genuine remorse, the kind that could no longer be contained. Annabelle Morse didn't just die in this boxcar. I killed her, not with my hands, but with my choices. I evicted her in February of '71, knowing the cold would kill her, knowing she had nowhere to go. I did it because Ashford Sr. paid me, because I wanted the money, because I didn't care about some woman who knew too much. The boxcar had gone silent except for the children's labored breathing and the storm's fury. I've carried that for 43 years, told myself it was just business, just following orders. But watching my daughter die because of a storm I can't control, being saved by a woman I tried to destroy, I can't let Emma die with my sins still hidden. I can't let your daughter die without telling the truth I should have told decades ago. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather journal, water-stained and worn. This is my ledger from 1850 to 1871. Every payment Ashford Sr. made me to look the other way, to falsify records, to evict people who asked too many questions. Every crime I helped him commit is documented here. I kept it as insurance, but I never used it. I just kept committing crimes and documenting them. He held it out to Cordelia with shaking hands. If our daughters live, I'll testify. I'll tell the federal land office everything. I'll face whatever consequences come. I'll give the Silver Creek family back what we stole. Both girls will live. Cordelia's voice cut through his confession with absolute certainty, a mother's refusal to accept any other outcome. Both of them will live, and you will testify, and justice will finally be done. Not because you're suddenly good, Mr. Webb, but because Annabelle Morse deserves it. Because the Silver Creek family deserves it. Because sometimes the only way to stop being a monster is to face what you've done and try to make it right, even when it costs you everything. Dawn of the fourth day brought a change. Eleanor's fever broke first, her eyes opening clear for the first time in 2 days, her breathing easing from desperate gasps to normal rhythm. Emma followed 2 hours later, her color returning, her parents weeping with relief. The storm ended that afternoon as abruptly as it had begun, the wind dying to nothing, the snow stopping mid-fall, leaving behind a world transformed. Cordelia opened the door to find snow 5 feet deep in places, drifts reaching to the boxcar's roof, the landscape unrecognizable. But the boxcar had stood. The shelter she had built from salvaged materials and desperate ingenuity had protected 14 people through the worst storm in 40 years. And now, as those 14 people emerged into the blinding sunlight, reflecting off endless white, they carried with them the knowledge of what had happened inside, the mercy extended, the confession made, the truth finally spoken. Martha Pendleton was the first to speak, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. I called you a fallen woman. I said you deserved to be thrown out. I told everyone you were living like an animal. But you're the strongest woman I've ever known. You saved our lives when we called you names. You gave us shelter when we gave you judgment. I'm ashamed of what I said, of what I did, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure everyone knows the truth about who you really are. Others echoed her words, each in their own way acknowledging what Cordelia had done, what she had built, how she had responded to cruelty with capability and to judgment with mercy. But it was Webb's words that mattered most, spoken in front of 13 witnesses who would remember. I'm going with you to Cheyenne. I'm going to the federal land office. I'm going to give them my ledger and my testimony. I'm going to tell them everything about what Ashford Sr. did, what I helped him do, what Victor has known and protected for decades. And then I'm going to face whatever justice demands. He looked at his daughter, healthy again, playing in the snow with Eleanor and the other children. That's the price of my daughter's life. That's the price of understanding, finally, that some debts can only be paid by telling the truth, no matter what it costs. 2 days later, as the town dug itself out from the storm's devastation, a telegram arrived at Augustus's office. He brought it to the boxcar himself, his old eyes bright with something that might have been vindication. David Silvercreek, he's alive, he's in Idaho, and he's coming to Cheyenne. Cordelia felt something loosen in her chest, not quite hope, but its cousin, possibility. When? He'll be there in 4 days. The federal land office has agreed to hear the case. Mrs. Thorne, we're going to trial. The journey to Cheyenne took a day by train. Cordelia, Eleanor, Augustus, Webb, and Benjamin Fletcher made the trip together, the documents and ledger wrapped carefully and guarded closely. Martha Pendleton and 6 others from the boxcar insisted on coming as witnesses, paying their own fares, determined that the woman who had saved their lives would not fight alone. Cheyenne was larger than Laramie, busier, colder in its indifference. The federal land office building stood imposing and gray, its windows reflecting nothing but sky. Inside, a hearing room had been prepared, not a courtroom exactly, but close enough. 5 federal commissioners would preside, men whose authority superseded territorial judges and local corruption. Victor was already there when they arrived, flanked by 2 expensive lawyers from Denver, men whose suits cost more than most families earned in a year. His eyes found Cordelia across the room, and what she saw there was not anger, but calculation. He still believed he could win this. The hearing opened on January 26, 1885. The room was crowded, word had spread, drawn by the scandal of old money facing accusations of fraud, by the spectacle of a widow challenging a powerful man, by the human appetite for watching the mighty fall. Augustus presented the case with precision. He laid out the history. Joseph Silvercreek's legitimate claim in 1850, properly filed and witnessed. The Ashford forgery, created the same day but supposedly hours earlier. The decades of wealth built on stolen land. He presented Annabelle's documents, the original claim papers with their authentic seals and signatures, the forgeries with their obvious discrepancies. Then Webb took the stand. He was sworn in, his hands shaking as it rested on the Bible. And he told the truth he had buried for 43 years. My name is Cornelius Webb. In 1850, I was 19 years old, working as a clerk in the Territorial Land Office. Ashford Sr. came to me with documents he claimed showed his prior claim to the Silverton mine. He offered me $500, more money than I'd ever seen, to stamp those documents as if they'd been filed that morning, before the Silver Creek claim. His voice gained strength as he continued. I knew the documents were forgeries. The signatures didn't match the handwriting samples on file. The seals were poorly copied, but I was young and poor, and $500 seemed like salvation. So I did it. I backdated the filing, I stamped the forgeries as legitimate, and the Silver Creek family lost everything. He pulled out his ledger, holding it up for the commissioners to see. For 20 years, Ashford Sr. paid me to keep quiet. Every payment is documented here. Every crime I helped commit. In 1871, a young woman named Annabelle Morse discovered the truth. She worked in the Ashford household. She found evidence of the fraud. So Ashford Sr. told me to get rid of her. I evicted her from the boxcar where she'd taken shelter, in the middle of winter, knowing she would die. And she did. 3 days later, she froze to death because I chose money over mercy. The room was silent. Even Victor's lawyer seemed stunned by the confession's directness. I've carried that guilt for 43 years. I told myself it was just business, just following orders. But it was murder, not with my hands, but with my choices. And last week, when my daughter nearly died in a storm, when we were saved by a woman I'd been trying to destroy on Victor Ashford's orders, I understood that some debts can only be paid by telling the truth. Augustus presented the ledger to the commissioners. They examined it page by page, seeing the meticulous record of corruption, the payments that stretched across 2 decades, the documentary proof of systematic fraud. Then David Silver Creek took the stand. He was 45 years old, his face weathered by a hard life, his eyes holding the accumulated grief of 2 generations who had died believing justice was impossible. My grandfather, Joseph Silver Creek, found silver in what's now called the Silverton Mine in April of 1850. He registered his claim properly, legally, following every rule. He worked that claim for 4 months before the Ashfords showed up with documents claiming they'd filed first. My grandfather protested. He had witnesses. He had his original filing papers. But the land office said the Ashford claim was legitimate, that there was nothing to be done. His voice roughened with emotion. My grandfather died in 1865, bitter and broken. My father spent his life trying to prove we'd been cheated, but he had no evidence, no way to fight men with money and power. He died in 1880, still fighting, still hoping. I grew up with stories about the mine that should have been ours, the life we should have had. I thought it was just a family myth, something we told ourselves to make poverty easier to bear, until Mr. Brennan's telegram arrived telling me someone had found proof. He looked at Cordelia, his eyes wet. This woman, Mrs. Thorne, she found what Annabelle Morse hid. She risked everything to bring the truth to light. She didn't know my family. She didn't owe us anything, but she did what was right, even though it cost her everything. Even though men with power tried to destroy her for it. Augustus called Martha Pendleton next, then the others from the boxcar. They testified about the storm, about Cordelia's shelter saving 14 lives, about Webb's confession in front of witnesses, about Victor's threats and attempts to silence the truth. Finally, Cordelia took the stand. She told her story simply. The expulsion, the boxcar, finding Annabelle's note, the search for truth, Victor's escalating threats. I didn't do this for money. I didn't do it for revenge. I did it because Annabelle Morse died asking someone to finish what she started. She died hoping justice might be served even after her death. And I thought about my daughter, about what kind of world she would grow up in, one where powerful men can steal and lie and destroy anyone who threatens them, or one where truth matters, where right matters, where one woman with nothing but courage can stand up and say, "No more." She looked directly at Victor. Mr. Ashford tried to destroy me because I wouldn't submit to him. He threw me and my daughter into the cold to die. He threatened to take my child. He tried to bury the truth the same way his family has been burying it for 40 years. But truth is a patient thing. It can wait decades in the frozen ground. But when it finally rises, no amount of money or power can push it back down. Victor's lawyers tried to discredit the evidence. They called Webb a criminal whose testimony couldn't be trusted. They claimed the documents might be forgeries themselves. They argued that 40 years was too long, that the statute of limitations had passed, that disturbing old claims would destabilize property rights throughout the territory. But the commissioners had seen enough. They examined the documents under magnification, comparing ink and paper and seals. They reviewed census records that proved the witnesses on the Ashford documents had never existed. They calculated the mathematical impossibility of the Ashford claim being filed hours earlier when the handwriting analysis showed it had been written with steel nib pens that weren't common in the territory until months after the Silver Creek claim. On January 28th, the commissioners issued their ruling. The chairman read it aloud, his voice formal, but carrying an edge of satisfaction, as if justice delayed had fermented into something more potent. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, this commission finds that the mining claim filed by Joseph Silver Creek on May 15, 1850, was legitimate, properly witnessed, and legally binding. We further find that the Ashford claim, purporting to be filed on the same date but at an earlier hour, was a forgery created with the assistance of Land Office Clerk Cornelius Webb, who has confessed to his role in the fraud. Victor's face went white, then red, his hands gripping the table in front of him. All mining rights, profits, and assets derived from the Silverton mine between 1850 and 1871 are hereby declared void. The Ashford family acquired those rights through fraud and maintained them through continued deception, and in the case of Annabelle Morse, through actions that resulted in her death. David Silver Creek is recognized as the legitimate heir to the original claim. The Ashford family is ordered to pay restitution to the Silver Creek estate in the amount of $487,000, representing the estimated value of silver extracted plus 40 years of accrued interest. Victor stood suddenly, his chair scraping back. "This is insane. You're destroying my family over 40-year-old claims? Over the word of a confessed criminal?" The chairman's voice cut through Victor's protest like ice. "We're enforcing the law, Mr. Ashford. The same law your grandfather violated. The same law you've been protecting through threats and intimidation. This commission also notes with concern your attempts to suppress this evidence through coercion, including threats to remove Miss Thorne's child from her custody based on false accusations. Be grateful we're not referring your conduct to territorial authorities for prosecution. Regarding custody of Eleanor Thorne, given evidence of your violent behavior documented by multiple witnesses and your demonstrable willingness to use legal mechanisms for personal revenge, this commission finds no grounds for your guardianship claim. Eleanor Thorne will remain with her mother." Victor walked out without another word, his lawyers scrambling to follow, already discussing appeals that would go nowhere, legal maneuvers that would find no purchase in federal law. In the corridor outside, David Silver Creek approached Cordelia, his weathered face wet with tears. "Mrs. Thorne, I want to share the settlement with you. Without you—" She raised a hand, gentle but firm. "I didn't do this for money, Mr. Silver Creek. I did it because it was right. Because Annabelle asked me to. Because my daughter was watching and learning what kind of person her mother would choose to be. Then let me do something else. The boxcar, I heard about it. Let me help you turn it into a real home. Let me give you the life Annabelle wanted for whoever came after her." Cordelia thought about the boxcar, about the shelter she had built from nothing, about the 14 lives it had saved. "There is one thing you could do. Name it. Help me create a place where other women like me, women with nowhere to go, women escaping violence, women who just need a chance, can find shelter. Not just a boxcar, but a community, a safe place. We could call it Annabelle's Haven." David's face broke into the first genuine smile she had seen from him. Annabelle's Haven. She would have liked that. "Yes, Mrs. Thorne. Yes, let's build something that matters." Webb approached last, his face haggard with the weight of confession and relief. "Mrs. Thorne, I've made arrangements. The boxcar, it's yours legally now. The adverse possession claim is filed and approved. The railroad released it officially, but I also spoke to the land office. The quarter-acre around it, that's railroad land being sold. I used my pension, bought it. The deed is in your name." He pressed papers into her hands, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "I can't undo what I did to Annabelle. I can't bring back the years the Silver Creek family lost. But I can give you this, a home. Legal, permanent, yours. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's what I have." Cordelia looked at the deed, at her name written in legal script, at the official seals and signatures that meant no one could ever take this from her again. "Thank you, Mr. Webb. Not for the deed, though I'm grateful. Thank you for choosing truth, finally, even when it cost you everything. It didn't cost me everything. It gave me back my soul." The train ride back to Laramie felt different. Eleanor sat beside her mother, watching the winter landscape roll past, her young mind processing everything she had seen. Justice served, truth acknowledged, powerful men held accountable. "Mama, what happens now?" Cordelia looked at the deed in her hands, at the settlement papers David had insisted she keep copies of, at the letter Augustus had written summarizing the case for newspapers in Denver and San Francisco. Now we build. We take that boxcar and we make it beautiful. We create Annabelle's Haven, a place where women who are scared and desperate and alone can find safety. We make sure Annabelle's death meant something. And Uncle Victor lost everything he built on lies. His mine, his money, his power, all of it gone. He'll have to start over, just like we did. But we learned how to build from nothing. I don't think he has. Is that justice? Cordelia thought about Annabelle freezing to death, about the Silver Creek family's decades of loss, about her own night of terror in the snow with Eleanor. It's a start, sweetheart. Justice is patient. Sometimes it takes 40 years, but it arrives. They returned to find the boxcar surrounded. The 14 people who had sheltered there during the storm had gathered, and they brought others. Lumber was stacked nearby, donated. Paint, windows, supplies, all given freely, some from guilt, some from gratitude, all from recognition that what Cordelia had built mattered. Silas stood at the front, leaning on his walking stick, his old face creased with satisfaction. Figured you'd be back today. Also figured you'd won, or you wouldn't be coming back at all. So we got started. Hope you don't mind. The work began immediately. Over the next weeks, the boxcar transformed. Fresh blue paint replaced rust. A wooden porch extended from the door. Real windows with glass panes let in light. A proper brick stove replaced the stone fire pit. Inside, walls were finished smooth, insulated properly, painted white. The sleeping platform became a real bed. Shelves held books donated by Benjamin. The cracked mirror was replaced with a new one, but Cordelia kept the old one, its spiderweb fractures a reminder of where they'd started. She kept Annabelle's tin box too, placing it on a shelf where she could see it every day. As spring arrived, transforming the frozen landscape into something gentler, the haven began to take shape. 5 more boxcars were donated by the railroad, arranged around Cordelia's in a small semicircle. David's settlement money paid for proper foundations, for connections to the town's water supply, for transforming abandoned freight cars into homes. 6 women and their children moved in that first year, each with her own story of escape, each finding shelter and safety and the chance to rebuild. Cordelia taught them what she had learned, how to see value in cast-offs, how to transform nothing into something, how to survive when the world said you couldn't. Eleanor, now 11, helped teach the children. She was still determined to become a lawyer, still fierce in her belief that justice mattered, that truth could win against power if you were brave enough to fight for it. Benjamin Fletcher visited regularly, his relationship with Cordelia developing slowly, carefully, built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than desperation or need. He helped with lessons, with legal paperwork, with the 1,000 small things that kept the haven running. Augustus took on more cases involving women and property rights, using the Silver Creek precedent to challenge other long-buried frauds, other powerful men who thought their wealth made them untouchable. Dorothea opened a small restaurant that employed women from the haven, teaching them skills that could lead to independence. Martha Pendleton became one of the haven's most vocal supporters. Her shame at her past judgment transformed into fierce advocacy for women whose society had condemned without evidence. Webb lived quietly, his confession having cost him his job and his standing, but his daughter's life had been saved and his conscience had been freed. He spent his remaining years working as a safety consultant, trying to prevent the accidents and collapses that had killed so many, trying to save lives to balance the one he'd taken. Victor disappeared after the ruling. Some said he went to Colorado to try the goldfields. Others said he'd gone east, back to family that might still support him. No one in Laramie ever saw him again, and no one particularly cared. He had become what Cordelia had been that first night, someone cast out, someone starting over with nothing. The difference was that she had learned to build. he had only ever known how to take. 2 years after the trial, on a spring evening in 1887, Cordelia stood on the porch of her home, legally hers, permanently hers, the deed hanging framed inside, and watched the sun set over Annabelle's haven. 8 families now lived in the converted boxcars. A vegetable garden flourished where snow had once buried everything. Children played in the yard while their mothers worked or rested or simply sat in safety for the first time in years. A wooden sign hung at the entrance. Annabelle's Haven, founded 1885. Below it, they had placed a stone marker. Annabelle Morse, 1845 to 1871. Her courage gave us home. Her truth set us free. Eleanor appeared beside her mother, now growing tall, her young face showing the first hints of the woman she would become. "M.A., do you think Annabelle knows about all this?" Cordelia looked at the haven, at the community they had built from nothing, at the lives that had been transformed because one woman, 43 years ago, had refused to let truth die with her. "I believe she does, sweetheart. I believe she's been watching all along, waiting for someone to finish what she started. And we did. We did. Not just for her, though. For all of us. For every woman who's been told she's worthless, that she can't survive, that she should accept whatever powerful men decide. We proved them wrong." Eleanor leaned against her mother's side, comfortable in silence, watching Ranger, gray-muzzled now, slower but still faithful, doze in the evening sun. "You know what I think?" Eleanor's voice was thoughtful, the question carefully considered. "What's that?" "I think Annabelle left that note knowing someone would find it. Maybe not that year, maybe not for decades, but she knew eventually someone desperate enough and brave enough would come. Someone who needed to find it as much as she needed to leave it. And that's you, Mama. You were meant to find it. You were meant to finish her work." Cordelia pulled her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her alive and healthy and safe. "Then I'm glad I was there. I'm glad we were both there. Because look what we built." They stood together as darkness fell, watching lights come on in the haven's windows, watching smoke rise from 8 chimneys, watching the proof that one woman's courage, preserved in a tin box for 43 years, could change everything. Inside, in the tin box on its shelf, Annabelle's original note remained. The words faded, but still legible, still true. "You are stronger than you know." Cordelia had proven that. Eleanor was learning it. And every woman who came to the haven would discover it for herself. Sometimes justice took 40 years to arrive. Sometimes truth had to be buried before it could grow. Sometimes the only way forward was to build from nothing, piece by salvaged piece, until nothing became home. And sometimes, Cordelia thought, the most important thing one woman could do was extend mercy to those who didn't deserve it, tell truth when lies were easier, and build something that would last long after she was gone. Annabelle's haven would last, of that she was certain. The story of the boxcar, the widow, and the truth that wouldn't stay buried, that would last too. And somewhere, in whatever place the dead went to rest, Annabelle Morse finally had her answer. Her death had not been for nothing.